The Mexican Revolution, a violent war and time of upheaval in Mexico that started in 1910. To truly understand this war, we need a good understanding of the man whose actions acted as a catalyst for this conflict. Porfirio Diaz. Diaz took power in 1876 at the age of 36. He would hold this position either directly or through one of his political followers until 1911. By the time Diaz took power, he was already a war hero, having seen combat during the French intervention. During the intervention, Diaz was captured by the French. Upon his escape, he was offered the position of Secretary of Defense, which he promptly declined. Instead, Diaz took position as commander of the Central Army. In 1870, Diaz ran for president against the incumbent President Juarez. When Diaz lost, he claimed it was due to fraud, and that Juarez had rigged the elections. In 1871, he issued his Plan de la Noria. In this plan, he called for the Mexican people to rebel against Juarez. Ironically, an identical plan would be issued many years later by Francisco Madero when he claimed that Diaz had rigged elections to remain in power. During his reign, Diaz was a rather oppressive leader. His slogan, Pan o Palo, meaning bread or death, meant you could follow him and be rewarded, or die. Unfortunately for the people who did follow Diaz, the bread, both literally and figuratively, rarely ever came. Diaz was highly focused on fueling the Mexican economy. To do this, he focused greatly on foreign investment. He allowed companies to open mines and factories across Mexico. In these factories, they would not be required to make sure the working conditions were safe for the people working there, or that they were paying fair enough wages. Thanks to this, Diaz did gain the favor of foreign investors. However, he lost that of his people. Jump ahead to 1900, and support for Diaz was nearly gone. His government was corrupt and his people desperate. During Diaz's time in power, he allowed many people to gain positions of power in the government through favors and backroom deals. In 1908, Diaz agreed to an interview with an American magazine. In this interview, he claimed he would not run for re-election in 1910. He only made this claim believing that the article would never actually end up in the hands of Mexican people. Unfortunately for him, it did. And when in 1910 he did run for re-election, many of the Mexican people did feel cheated and felt that Diaz had flat out lied to them, which he did. As support for Diaz fell during the election, and support rose for one Francisco Madero, Diaz began to feel fear. In response, he went so far as to jail Francisco Madero. This is a move Diaz would regret later on. When Diaz quote-unquote won the presidency in 1910, despite his record low approval ratings, it was obvious he had won through fraud. Because of this, the exiled Madero called for a revolt. This revolt would eventually become known as the Mexican Revolution. Diaz was smart enough to realize he would die if he stayed. Because of this, he left Mexico behind. He would leave behind a country destined for years of violence and fighting. His policies of focusing more on foreign investment than on the needs of his people left the country unstable and many people without the resources they needed. Many of the peasants didn't have enough land to actually grow enough food to support themselves. All of the land in the country was mostly owned by haciendas, large plantations that were for more commercial export than actually anything else. Diaz failing to address these concerns was what led many peasants to be so willing to revolt against him when Madero put out his plans against Diaz. The more middle-class citizens of Mexico were very willing to go against Diaz due to his lack of regulation of working conditions in the mines and factories. Diaz had not only allowed, but almost encouraged companies to take advantage of the workers just so that way he could gain favor and personal wealth.